Welcome to The Explainer. I am so incredibly thrilled you're joining me today because we are going on a really fascinating journey through some ancient source texts. If you love history, theology, and kind of getting to the absolute root of how our cultural ideas are formed, well, you are definitely in the right place. Today, we're going to bust some major historical myths by looking directly at the ancient texts themselves, and we'll decode how centuries of translation and interpretation have actually shifted our core understanding of morality. So think about this for a second. What is the true cost of inhospitality? And what is the spiritual value of a laugh? Now, I know that might seem like a totally random pairing of concepts, but the answers hidden in our source material today are profound. In fact, what we find in these historical texts might completely shatter your preconceived notions about ancient biblical ethics.
Here's a quick roadmap of where we're headed today in The Explainer. Number 1, reinterpreting biblical morality. 2, uncovering the true sin of Sodom. 3, the spiritual power of laughter. 4, radical mercy. And 5, empathy as the ultimate lesson.
All right, let's jump right into part 1, reinterpreting biblical morality, the assumption.
Let's start with a foundational assumption we almost all share. When most of us hear the phrase biblical morality, a very specific kind of heavy vibe comes to mind, right? We think of strict rules, solemnity, and fiery retribution. We picture this highly rigid framework where any deviation at all is immediately met with divine wrath and where life is basically entirely devoid of lightness or joy. But what the actual historical text and the theological debates reveal is that these cultural touchstones wildly oversimplify and, honestly, in some cases, completely misrepresent the original source material.
Which brings us to part 2, the true sin of Sodom, beyond the fire. Okay, let's really dive into this one, because there is perhaps no story more associated with fiery retribution than the destruction of Sodom and Gomorrah. Culturally, these cities have become totally synonymous with one very specific type of transgression. But when we actually look at the historical texts, a completely different picture emerges, and it illustrates a massive gap. So the modern popular view overwhelmingly associates Sodom with sexual immorality. But if you look in the Hebrew Bible, specifically the book of Ezekiel, chapter 16, it explicitly names their sins. It says, "Behold, this was the iniquity of thy sister Sodom, pride, fullness of bread, and careless ease. Neither did she strengthen the hand of the poor and needy." So the actual root of their ruin was sheer arrogance and a cruel systemic lack of hospitality to the vulnerable.
So how in the world did we get from ignoring the poor to our modern understanding? Well, this timeline maps it out perfectly. In the original Genesis account, God destroys the cities for their wickedness, but no specific sin is actually singled out as the cause. Then later on, the prophets, like Ezekiel, specifically define that sin is pride and a refusal to help the needy. It wasn't until much later that the philosopher Philo of Alexandria introduced the focus on sexual sins. And from the 6th century onward, that interpretation gained serious traction, eventually becoming fully accepted church dogma by the 12th century, which authorities then used to justify criminalizing same-sex practices. The linguistic debate actually hinges on the Hebrew word yada, meaning to know, which the mob in Genesis uses when demanding Lot bring out his guests. But historically, the original prophetic focus was squarely on their extreme inhospitality.
And to truly grasp just how horrifying this lack of hospitality actually was, we can look at Jewish traditional texts like the Book of Jasher. The anecdotes in here are just terrifying. According to these texts, providing bread and water to the poor was treated as a literal capital offense in Sodom. One of Lot's daughters, Paltid, was allegedly burnt alive on a pyre simply for giving a poor man bread. And another woman in a neighboring city was stripped, covered in honey, and stung to death by bees just for giving a traveler some water. These texts tell us that it was the cries of these murdered, charitable women that created the outcry to heaven. The sin wasn't just, a lack of manners, it was a legally enforced, violently cruel lack of hospitality. All right, moving on to part 3, the spiritual power of laughter, the unexpected joy. Now, let's do a total 180 and pivot from the incredible gravity of Sodom to something entirely unexpected. We're transitioning from absolute cruelty to absolute lightness. We're going to look at the concept of joy in a text that, as we discussed earlier, so many people assume to be completely humorless. Get this. One of the major biblical patriarchs, Isaac, or Yitzhak in Hebrew, literally translates to "he laughs." And that isn't just a fun piece of trivia. It actually embeds the very concept of laughter into the foundational lineage of the text. Laughter isn't forbidden here. It is quite literally foundational. Look at this quote from Sarah in Genesis 21:6.
It perfectly captures the moment Isaac is born. Remember, Sarah had faced a lifetime of barrenness and the social humiliation that came with it back then. When she's told she'll have a son in her old age, she initially laughs out of pure disbelief. But when the child is actually born, her laughter transforms. As theological scholars point out, this laughter represents a divine liberation from suffering. It's a spiritual power that completely subverts human expectations. It is the joy of the impossible literally breaking into reality.
Now, what's really fascinating about this is that historically there was a fierce debate over this very joy. During the Middle Ages, you had two distinct camps regarding laughter. On one side, we have the Desert Fathers and St. Benedict, who viewed laughter with deep, deep suspicion. To them, the spiritual life was intensely serious, and laughter represented a dangerous loss of self-control. But on the flip side, we have absolute heavyweights like St. Augustine and St. Thomas Aquinas who passionately defended it. In fact, Aquinas argued that a person who never laughs and is always gloomy actually harms those around them. He elevated humor and laughter to a duty of charity, an absolutely essential component of a healthy, loving community life.
Let's shift gears to part 4. Radical mercy and righteousness, the core philosophy.
This perfectly sets up our next source, which shifts our focus to the ultimate ethic that binds both that hospitality and that joy together. We're talking about the core philosophy of ancient morality, the radical call for mercy. Just listen to this directive from the Gospel of Luke. Love your enemies, do good to those who hate you, be merciful just as your Father is merciful. This text fundamentally redefines righteousness. It proves that true righteousness was never meant to be about rigid perfection or fiercely punishing those who step out of line. Instead, it's defined by the active, loving, and merciful treatment of others. It's an outward-facing philosophy, plain and simple.
And finally, part 5, empathy as the ultimate lesson. Let's move ahead and see how this builds our final conclusion. We've looked at the destruction of a city, the birth of a child named Laughter, and a radical command to love our enemies. It's time to bring all three of these seemingly totally disparate topics together into one cohesive paradigm shift. When we synthesize these ancient sources, this stunning thematic through line emerges. It's like a giant puzzle coming together. The true lesson of Sodom is the vital, life-saving importance of welcoming the stranger and caring for the vulnerable. The lesson of Isaac and Sarah is that joy, laughter, and the humility of self-deprecation are divine gifts that build up a community. And the lesson from Luke is that radical mercy toward our enemies is the highest form of justice. The overarching theme across all of these texts is a profound, empathetic righteousness.
So, the crucial point we need to take away is this: empathy over strict rigidity. Why does this matter to you and me today? Well, because it directly challenges our modern cultural obsession with rule-keeping, punishment, and drawing strict lines between us and them. These ancient texts are not inviting us into a life of solemn, fiery retribution, not at all. They're inviting us to a life characterized by charity, subversive joy, open doors, and profound empathy for the human condition. I want to leave you with this final thought to ponder. If true morality is actually rooted in hospitality, joy, and mercy, how might these ancient lessons change the way you treat the strangers in your own life today? Really think about that as you go about your week. Thank you so much for joining me on this explainer. I genuinely hope this sparked your curiosity, and I highly encourage you to keep exploring and learning. See you next time.